Hi everyone, today we're going to learn how to download Xcode, which is Apple's integrated development environment. Basically, it's a one-stop shop or the tool we use to make our iPhone applications. Let's get started. Alright, so to start downloading Xcode, we're going to first need an Apple ID. We can get that by going to Safari, which should either be on your dock, or if for some reason it's not there, you can also go to the top right-hand corner and open up Spotlight and enter in Safari. And take a look, it should be your first result. Open it up. In the search bar here, you can type in Google, like so, and type in Apple ID. And the first result that comes up should be appleid.apple.com. And you can go to create an Apple ID. And you're going to need to fill in all of the required fields here. You're also going to need an email address so that you can confirm your information. Apple will send you an email. Many of you have probably already done this if you've already installed any applications on your computer before. So if you already have your Apple ID, you don't need to go through that process. Again, the next thing you need to do is we're going to need to open up the App Store. For me, it's actually on my dock again, but again, if you don't have it, you can go to Spotlight and type in App Store. Open it up and type in Xcode in the search bar here, and you can press install, and it's going to ask for your Apple ID and your password. So I'm going to enter that in now, and I'm going to press sign in, and it's going to start installing. Today we're going to start by exploring Xcode, learning all the different inspectors and what all the tabs do. We're also going to build our first application. It's going to be fairly simple. You're going to be able to press a button and update the text on one label inside of your view. Let's get started. So hopefully you were able to download Xcode without any problems. And if you went ahead and downloaded Xcode and opened it up, it may appear in your dock. So you may be able to open it up from here. Or you can also go to your Spotlight and type in Xcode and open it this way as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Xcode. And this first screen we see here is the ability to create a new project, as well as other open projects that I've used before. So if this is your first application, which is the one you'll be creating right now, this will probably be blank for you. But as you start creating some applications and using them, this will start to fill up with your recent applications. So you can go ahead and select Create a New Xcode Project. And for now, we're going to be choosing iOS application, single view application, but let's take a minute and talk about what some of these other options are. So below here we see OS X, and we actually have the ability to create OS X or the applications for the Mac operating system. We won't be doing that in this course, but this is an option, and it's actually also written in Objective-C. We also have access to a bunch of templates in iOS, including master detail, which you will see often when you want two views simultaneously. As an example, in the iPad email application, you see there's both a menu on the left as well as the current email on the right. OpenGL is super useful for creating games, and it's integrated, although we won't be covering that in this course. Page-based applications are really common for opening tutorials. Single view, which we'll be using, sets up some boilerplate code so we get an initial view or a place we can present information to the user on a single screen. And this will link up the code to create this single screen for us. So our project will get created with a single screen. Tabbed application is really common in many photo applications, including Instagram. Utility applications are less common, but as an example, you can go ahead and open up the Stocks application on your iPhone, and you'll see an example of what a utility application looks like. Empty application is just that, it's empty. And unlike the single view application that we'll be using, we won't immediately have a view controller, so nothing will be presented on the screen, whereas when we run our application with the single view application, we get a white screen because we haven't added anything to it yet. And Sprite Kit is one of the newer templates, and this allows us to create games and is definitely worth checking out if you're interested in games. Although we'll be sticking with the Cocoa Touch framework to make iPhone applications, not games. So we can go ahead and select Next after selecting Single View Application. And next we come to a screen where we need to choose some options to create our new project. And the first thing we need to do is create a product name. So I'm going to call this My First Application. And notice that I'm using camel case here, which is capitalizing the letters, the first letter for each word. And this is really common in Objective-C. In some other programming languages, you may have used underscores, but for Objective-C, it's very common to use this camel case. Next, you can put in an organization name. If you don't have one, you don't have to fill this in. It's not required. You see we don't get an error here. But if you have one, you can put it in here. For the company identifier, I've gone ahead and put a reverse DNS.myname here. But again, if you don't have your own URL, you can go ahead and just put self.edu.yourname. This is also valid. So I'm going to put this back in. And next we have a class prefix. And class prefixes are really useful later on when we're going to be creating files so that it's very obvious to us that these are our created files and not something that someone else created or maybe Apple created. So it's really handy to put class prefix in. I'm doing CC for Code Coalition. If you, again, don't have your own organization, you could put your initials, so I could put EA if I wanted to. And if you use a different class prefix, just be aware that when you're looking at the code, anytime you see a CC, you're instead going to see your own class prefix that you entered when you're taking a look at your files. So don't be thrown. The names will look very similar, except it'll have a different class prefix in front of it. And in fact, some people find it helpful to use a different class prefix because it's obvious to them, like, oh, that's where this is being changed. We can also select a device here, and we can select between the iPad, iPhone, or a universal application. A universal application will deploy to both the iPad and iPhone simultaneously. To keep things a little bit simpler, we're going to go ahead and select iPhone for now, and we'll talk about the iPad later on in the course. So we can go ahead and press Next. And next we have the option where to save our project. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this right to my desktop. And you can feel free to press the source control button. We won't get to source control until section 3, where we'll be able to start pushing our projects up to GitHub, but it causes no problem to just initialize our project with a Git repository. So we can go ahead and press create. And let me go ahead and expand my project out. And now we have our first Xcode project. Great, so now we've been able to create our first Xcode project. And let's take a minute. First, let's open up our Xcode project so it fills up the whole screen. Xcode has a lot going on that we can see here, so the more space we have, the easier it'll be to see everything that's going on. At first glance, there might be a ton of stuff here and it might be a little intimidating and overwhelming, but in the end, this will actually be a huge advantage because Xcode in many ways acts as a one-stop shop where we can build code, add graphical elements, and even deploy to the App Store, all from this one tool. So in the long run, familiarizing yourself with this tool will pay off huge dividends as you learn how to make iPhone applications. First, let's take an overview of what this environment we're looking at and try to demystify it a little bit. In this top left corner here, we have the run area, where we can actually run a simulator of our application. And our simulator will mirror an iPhone or an iTouch, and we're going to be able to deploy and see what our application looks like right now. So go ahead and press the run button. And when this thing loads up, we'll be able to see that it's going to be a blank screen. And this blank screen is going to be reflective of the fact that we chose single view application as our template, which meant that our application did not start with any initial elements on our view, but a view was in fact hooked up, and that's this white area here. We also can press the stop button, which will start up our application from running. And if we open up our simulator again, we'll be able to see that by moving to the left area over here, we get to see that we have photos, contacts, settings. In fact, if you were going to deploy your application to a foreign country or another language, you could press the General button, International, and change your language. So you could set your simulator to be in a different language to test that your functionality worked properly. Additionally, it's worth noting that the simulator can get buggy from time to time, so closing it out after you're done using it is a really handy tool to prevent issues. As we move to the right, in this top right area over here, the first area we're going to look at is the editor area. And the option we're going to look at today is called the Assistant Editor, which we'll be covering more in the next video. But for now, if you click it, we're going to be able to open up two screens side by side. And later on, what this is going to allow us to do is to open two files simultaneously. Let's go ahead and go back to the standard editor, which will show us this single view again. Incidentally, for those of you who are curious, this third option over here is for version editor, but we're not going to be touching on that today. In fact, if you try to open that up right now, unless you initialize your project with Git, it'll actually break because we don't have version control in our application right now. The next is our view toggle area, and in this left one here, we can open and close the Navigator area, which is this left bar over here. We can also open the bottom area here, which by default is not open. And the left area is a debug area where we're going to be able to take a look at our objects in memory later on, for those of you who are familiar with objects. And this right area over here is where we're going to be able to print things out to our console. We're not going to be doing any of that today, so we can go ahead and close that area back up. The final area that we're going to be opening and closing is the Utilities area, which is this right bar over here. Later on, when we have our view objects, we're going to be able to adjust the attributes of our view objects using this tab. For now, let's take a look at this left-hand area, the Navigator area. We're not going to cover what all these different tabs do. I'll just quickly scroll through them so you can see that there are, in fact, a bunch of different tabs. For now, though, we're going to leave this folder selected, which provides a graphical way to see all of the files currently added to our project. Some of you might not be able to see all of the files that I have selected because you haven't used the drop-down. So simply click this little toggle here and you'll be able to see all of the files inside of this group, supporting files, as well as all the frameworks that have gotten automatically included as part of our single view application. Next, let's take a look at this main area. We're not going to be adjusting anything in here today, but here we can use toggles like these buttons here for landscape left and right to choose whether or not our device or our application will be supporting landscape mode or not. In fact, it's becoming very popular for many applications to only support the portrait view. As you scroll down, you're going to see some launch images here. These are the images that pop up when your application first loads, as well as frameworks that have already gotten linked up. Let's open up the storyboard file from our Navigator on the left here. And we can see now that there's this graphical interface which directly reflects what appeared on our simulator earlier when we ran it. In this lower right-hand area here, which is the main area on the screen that we haven't covered yet inside of Xcode, is our libraries area. And right now we have the file template library, which will allow us to drag code in and have that appear inside of our view controllers. For now, we're actually going to select the third one from the left, which is our object library. And if we scroll up and down, we're going to be able to see that there's a bunch of different view objects that you might be familiar with. Things like a stepper, where you can increment by one or more. You might also see image views, right? We can replace and set our image views to make images or pictures appear inside of our application. Scroll up until you find the label, or scroll down depending on where you are in this list. Alternatively, you can also search for the label by going down to this bottom area here and typing in label. And drag and drop by holding down the label into your project. Make sure you move it towards the top. There's an instance where having it towards the middle, your label might not appear when you run the simulator. We'll talk in a later video about why that's occurring. But for now, just keep your label towards the top. And you can double click on the label and replace the text with Hello World. And we can go ahead and rerun our simulator by pressing this run button on the top left corner again. And our simulator will open and Hello World will appear. Now that we've been able to display a label with the text Hello World on it on our simulator, it's time to go ahead and figure out how to add a button so that we can dynamically change our label in code. So let's go ahead and we can type in button at the bottom here and drag a button in. You'll notice that in our object library here, we have quite a few different types of buttons. We want to make sure we just select the button. And we can use these blue guiding lines to make sure that we're centering this up. And we can actually even change the text by double clicking on our button and saying something like press me. And we can center this up again. And the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to hook up both of these elements to what we call our view controller. And basically what this is going to allow us to do is in code, our view controllers are responsible for managing this view. And this view is currently on our storyboard, which is where we can add our graphical elements. So in order to hook this up, or at least to make our view controller aware that these view objects exist so we can change them in code, we can hold down the Alt key and press on cc viewcontroller.h. And this is what's called the header file here, and we'll talk more about what this is in our later videos together. But for now, we want to figure out how to hook up view objects to our view controller so that we can access these view objects in code. So we're going to go ahead and hold down the control key with the label selected, and we can confirm that our label is in fact selected by looking in our scene outline here on the left. And with my label selected, I'm going to go ahead and control drag to my header file here, and I'm going to see insert outlet or outlet connection. Now it's really important that you don't drag it up to the top here, right? It's not going to appear, and it's important that you don't try to drag it below this at end either, because it won't work either. So we want to drag it in between, and it's going to say insert outlet or outlet connection. You can release, and we'll get this connection type. So here we're going to say this is an outlet. Outlets are the way we change our view object's attributes. It's the way we get access to our view object. And specifically, we're going to create an IB outlet here. We're not going to create an outlet connection. We won't be using those in this course. So we need to give this a name, and we can call this something like title label. And notice that I'm using camel case here. And we want to give the type as a UI label, and its storage type is going to be strong. Don't worry too much about these options right now. We'll be doing quite a bit of this in terms of hooking up different view objects, so we'll have plenty of time to get used to this process. So we can press connect, and incidentally, if you're interested, UI label is the class or the type of view object, right? This is a UI label that we dragged in. Title label is the name, and when we selected strong, we selected the pointer type was going to be a strong pointer. Right? So it increases the retain count by 1. IB outlet here simply says that this is a pointer to a view object on our storyboard. So it's a helper for the compiler. And finally, there's two other things we have here. We have non-atomic, which we won't get into locking code right now, but this makes it not thread safe. And at property here says that this view object is an attribute of our view controller. So we're going to talk about properties in depth, but this is the code that gets generated when we connect up our view object. And we'll figure out how to access this view object in code in just a minute. We're going to be doing that accessing in ccviewcontroller.m. Now before we get there, we want to hook up our button. And so we can control drag to our header file again. And we see that this time we actually have another option. It says insert outlet, action, or outlet connection. Now we could make this an outlet if we wanted to change our button dynamically. If we wanted to add a different background color, some sort of text color. But we actually want to use an action for our connection type here because we want some code or a method, which is just a bit of code, to evaluate when we press our button. Specifically, we're going to want to change our label's text dynamically when we press our button. So the naming convention for buttons should hint to the fact that it is in fact an action. So we can go ahead and call this button pressed, and this says in fact that some action has occurred. The button was pressed. We can also change the type to UI button, although if you leave it as ID it won't make any difference. We'll talk more about parameters right now, but this is going to set the parameter to be of type UI button. We can also select the event type to be touch up inside. We're going to touch up inside our button in order for the event to trigger. And this is just the default, so we can leave that. And the arguments, we're also going to use the default as sender. Again, we'll talk more about these options later on, but these are the options you want to select. So we can press connect, and we see that this code that got generated looks much different than the property we generated. So we see IB action and just a subtraction sign here. It says button pressed, UI button sender. Well, this is actually a method, and IB action actually gets typedef to void, so this method does not return anything. And if that makes no sense, don't worry about it. We're going to be covering methods in quite a bit of depth as we go through the course. So bear with me, we're going to figure out how this method works together. So let's go back to single view, and we're going to go to ccViewController.m, and you're going to write your first bit of Objective-C code. So we see this button pressed actually also had code generated here. And I'm going to go ahead and add some returns to make this a little bit closer to the way Apple generates their methods. And basically what happens here is when the user presses the button, everything inside of these curly braces will evaluate. So we can run a line of code here. And what this code is going to do is it's going to change our label's text property. Now again, we're going to have to talk about properties later on, but for now, we can figure out how to at least make them work. So we're going to say use the self keyword, and what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to access that attribute we set up in our header file. So we're going to be able to say title label, and labels happen to have a property called text, and we can actually chain our properties together, and properties are just attributes. So our label has a property text, and if we set this equal to the correct type or a type that it understands, specifically we're going to use an NS string, which is the ability to join characters together, and we can display that as text here. So we're going to say @quote, and we're going to say hello class. And this is just shorthand to create an NS string, and an NS string is the same type as our text here. In fact, if we go ahead and press delete here and start typing text, we see that its class is NS string here. So even though you probably don't understand everything that's going on here, hopefully you're seeing that Xcode is providing all these cool colors here, and it's providing all these helpers as we're typing things in to help us autocomplete and get things in correctly. You can see that there are other properties here of our title labels. So specifically, you might recognize text color, text alignment. You might not be familiar with text input mode, but that's okay. We're not going to be using that for quite a long time. So we're going to stick with text here. And when we press our button, this code should evaluate. We're only going to evaluate one line of code, and it should update the title label's text property to say hello class. So let's go ahead and run our application here. And when it loads up, we should see hello world appear first. And then when we press our button, we should be able to convert it to hello class. And you can feel confident that you've written your first line of code. So let's go ahead and press our button here, and we see it switches to hello class. Well, now we've been able to change the title of our label, but it still looks pretty ugly. So let's go ahead and figure out how to change some of the attributes, both the color and the font for both our label, our button, as well as our background. I'm kind of bored of a white background here. So I'm going to go to my main storyboard file, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have our scene outline open here. Now, if for some reason this gets closed, you can press this button down here at the bottom to open and close it. And what this will allow you to do is it'll allow you to make sure that you have the correct view object selected, because if you have the wrong one selected, you won't see things properly in the attributes inspector. So let's go ahead and start with our label here. We'll start with our top object. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change its color. So let's go ahead and press this color. We're going to go to the bottom here and select Other. And let's lighten this up so we can drag up to the top here. And let's go ahead and make this red. So I'll drag there, press Exit, and we now see that my label is red. We can also change the font, so I can press this little T here. And instead of System, let's go ahead and select Custom. And this will allow me to change the family. So we can choose something like Futura. And let's go ahead and also adjust this and make this larger while we're here. Go ahead and press Done. And we see that now my label has outgrown the size I created with, and the text is too large. So if I hover over these guiding dots here, I can go ahead and make my label larger so that the text fits here. But I've made this too large and now it's aligning to the left, and I can go ahead and center this up again, but it looks kind of off. So I can also change the text alignment to be centered, so again it's centered in my application. I can also change my button here, and let's again go ahead and change the font here. So I'm going to go to Custom, and we can choose, no, we want to choose the family here. And for this one, let's go ahead and choose Courier. And again, I can upgrade the size. Press Done. And we see once again, my text has outgrown the size of my button. So let's go ahead and drag this out, and we can recenter this up. And now we see that my button is larger, and I've been able to change both the color and font of my button. The final thing I want to do in terms of changing the look of this application is to press on the view. And all view controllers get created with a view, and this is kind of, you can think about the background or the base level that everything gets added on top of. So we can actually change the background color of our view here. And we're going to go ahead and we could select one of our presets, and let's just choose light gray for now. So now we have our nicely designed application. Let's go ahead and press Stop and press Run. Incidentally, the issue I mentioned earlier, the reason we're putting this stuff at the top, is the default simulator is the iPhone Retina 3.5-inch screen. However, what we're using in our simulator here is a 4-inch screen. So we can actually switch this to the iPhone Retina 4-inch. And now it'll proportion it properly, and we could move these labels down to the bottom of our project if we were so inclined. So after running this, you can go ahead and see that these colors are reflected. And there's one other thing I want to mention. If for some reason your simulator is too large or too small, you can change the size of your simulator. With your simulator selected, press the window, and you can scale it. So I've gone ahead and choose 75%. You can change it to a different scale if you're so inclined. So you can press the press me, and we see that the color is still working as well. Next, we want to add a text field into our storyboard here. And what a text field will allow us to do is to enter information. Apple takes care of presenting the keyboard, although we will have to manually dismiss the keyboard ourselves. So in order to add a text field, go into your object library. So we're going to make sure we have the third option here. We can remove our search, and we can search for text field, or we can scroll down and find it ourselves. So it's right underneath the segmented control here. We have our text field, and we can drag this into our project. And I'm going to go ahead and enlarge this a bit so we have a bit more space to write something. And I'll center this up like so. Now let's hook this up to our viewcontroller.h file. So remember how we opened up the ccviewcontroller.h file. We held down the Alt key and pressed on ccviewcontroller.h. And we're going to add an IB outlet because we want to be able to access the information in our text field. We don't need to be told, or we don't want some sort of logic to occur. And when we enter information into our text field, we want the logic to occur when we press our button. And we've already created an IB action for that. So we're going to hold down the Control key, and with our text field selected, and we're going to confirm that in our scene outline here, we can Control drag right below our other IB outlet here. And we could actually even make this an action. That would be all right, but we want to use an outlet connection for the code we want to write. So we're going to go ahead and call this text field. Notice that I'm using camel case. The F is capitalized here. It's very important that when you write things, even if you want to use your own names, you're consistent. So if you use a capital F here and you try to access it with a lowercase f later on, your computer program won't work properly. Our type is going to be UI text field, and our storage type is going to be strong. We can press connect. And let's go back to single view. So you can press in the single view here on the top. And we're going to go to ccViewController.m. And now that we have a property called text field, we're going to be able to update our labels text property to reflect or be the information in our text field. So the way we access the information in our text field is we say self.textField, right? So this is the second example, right, where we've been able to access one of our view objects, right, using this self keyword. And text field also has a property text. So when I press my button, whatever text is in the text field will get set equal to or will update the labels text property. There's one other thing we want to do here, and that's we want to make the keyboard go away ourselves. So let's go ahead and run our application first so we can take a look at what this currently looks like. So let's go ahead and we can type something in here. Let's say, hey. And if we press the press me button, we see hey updates it, but the keyboard is still here, and that looks pretty ugly. So let's go ahead and fix that. In this method, we're going to say self.textField, and we're going to say resign first responder. Oh man, we got some new syntax here. Instead of using this equal sign, which sets a value, right, we're setting the text property of our title label. Here we're using bracket notation, and notice that all of our statements in Objective-C end in a semicolon. Well, what that means is every time we write a line of code here, we have to add a semicolon at the end, but the reason we have brackets here is we're doing what's called a method call. Now I mentioned earlier that button press was a method, and we could in fact call this button press method inside of the button press method and do something what's called recursion. However, we're not going to do that right now. Instead, we're going to focus on making our keyboard go away. And basically what this is the way I tell an object to do some sort of action or to make some sort of code evaluate, I call a method. And in order to call a method, I have to use this bracket notation. And again, don't panic if this looks completely crazy. Just make sure you're getting it in there correctly with the correct syntax. And we'll be covering methods and method calls quite extensively throughout our course together. So you'll be an expert by the time you get through all of our material. So for now, we're just calling this method which tells my text field, hey, you should make the keyboard go away. So let's go ahead and rerun our application. And now let's go ahead and enter some information. And notice that the keyboard doesn't just go away right here, right? If I press the return key, keyboard isn't going away. It's only when I press the button that the keyboard now goes away because I told the keyboard to go away when I press my button, right? So all of the logic inside of this method or all of the logic inside of these curly braces evaluates then. Cool, so let's go back to the storyboard, and there's one final update we want to make here. And unique to text fields is this placeholder attribute. Again, I'm going to make sure I have this attributes inspector selected here. And with placeholder text, I can tell the user or give the user some hints. So enter information. And what this will do is when the user starts typing, it'll make this placeholder go away. Right? So let's see how that works. We'll rerun our application one more time here. Try to run it twice. And we see enter information. Now when I click in and I start to type, we see that the placeholder text gets removed. Right? But if I delete, we see that the placeholder text comes back. So we were able to add our own placeholder in order to customize our text field a bit. So now we want to go ahead and add another view controller. We're going to figure out how to display an image on that new view controller. We're also going to figure out how to transition from this current view controller to another view controller completely in our storyboard. So we're not going to have to write any code for this. So the first thing you want to do is you want to go to the course website and make sure you download the image. I've already gone ahead and done so. So we'll see that this image is now on my desktop here. And I'm going to go ahead and select my image and I'm going to drag it into my project. And right now I'm going to drag it into supporting files and I'm going to let go. And it's going to give me some options to add this file. So we're always going to be selecting copy items into destination group folder if needed. We're also going to use create groups for any added folders. And we're really going to make sure that we have add to targets, my first application selected. This one and this one are very important. The top one here is going to go ahead and create a deep copy of our image for our project, so it's not going to link to this image on the desktop. So if I deleted this image on my desktop, it would still work because I'm going to actually copy this into my project. Adding this to targets will make my project aware of this image. And if I'm adding a whole bunch of files, it's really nice to create groups for them so that they're nicely organized. So we can go ahead and press finish. And now we've added the image. We're going to use that in just a minute. So back to our storyboard here, we're going to go ahead and you can either search for a view controller or you can scroll to the top. It should be the first object in your object library and drag another view controller in. Now with this new view controller, I'm going to go ahead and add an image view onto it. So we can go ahead and type image view in here and drag it in. And notice that it automatically enlarges the size of our view controller here. We could drag it down and make our image view smaller if we wanted to. Reposition this a little bit. And in just a minute, we'll be adding a navigation controller, which will add a nav bar at the top. So we can kind of preempt that and make this image view a little bit smaller. Now, sometimes for some reason, the image doesn't immediately become available to us. So what we can do is we can do what's called a clean. And holding down the command key, the shift key, and the K button, we can clean our project. Right now I have my project running, so it's asking me if I want to stop. We see clean succeeded, and now we can go ahead and select our image view. And with the attributes inspector selected here, there's some other inspectors we're not going to get into right now. We can use the drop down here on image and see images-2.jpg available to us. So we can go ahead and select this. And right now it looks pretty ugly. So let's go ahead and change the mode and select aspect fill. And now it's much more nicely proportioned. Now if I run my application right now, I'm just going to see this hello world impress me. I'm not going to see this new view controller. So how can I make sure that this new view controller launches? Well, I can go over here and I can grab this white arrow, which is the entry point into your project or from your storyboard. And it basically tells your project where to start. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this white arrow over to my new view controller. And we see now that I'm going to start here. And if I run my application, so let's go ahead and do that, we should see my globe appear. Okay, so that's great. But what we want to be able to do is transition from this view controller to the new view controller. So let's drag our white arrow back. And to do this, we're going to use a navigation controller. So with my view controller selected, and I'm going to make sure that I have my view controller selected in my scene outline, we're going to go to Editor, and we're going to select Embed In, and we're going to choose Navigation Controller. So we see now this view controller has a nav bar at the top. And we see actually that my label is under my nav bar. So let's go ahead and move all three of these down here. So we can select them all and drag them at once. So now we have a little bit more space. And we need to figure out a way to transition from this view controller to the next view controller. Well, let's go ahead and add a different type of button. So down at the bottom here, we can go ahead and type button in. But we're not just going to add a regular button. We're going to choose bar button item. And what this is going to allow us to do is we can add a button to our nav bar up here. So we can add this to the top here. And in my attributes inspector, I can change the title to next page, press enter, or return. And it'll go ahead and add next page. And now I can select my bar button item and confirm that I'm selecting it in my scene outline. And holding down the control key, I'm going to drag to this view controller. So the whole thing is going to light up here. And when I release, it's going to say action seg, and it's going to give me three options here. We're going to be choosing push, which will create another nav bar here, and it'll give me the back button functionality for free. Now, if I chose modal, the whole view controller would take up the entire screen, but we wouldn't be able to go back to our first view controller without having to write some code. And we're not going to get into custom right now. So we're going to go ahead and select push, and we see that it's gone ahead and added a nav bar here. So let's go ahead and run our application, and we should be able to press the next button, next page button, and we see that we get this back button for free, even though it doesn't appear. So we press back, and we go back to our first view controller here. So we learned how to add in our own image to display that image, as well as how to transition between two different view controllers. The final thing I want to mention here is that we didn't set up a class to manage this new view controller that we added. And even though this is named CC View Controller, only this view controller is managed by the CC View Controller class. So let's prove this to you. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and press on ccviewcontroller.h. And before, we were able to control drag from our view objects right into our project. But we see because this new view controller that we added is not managed by ccviewcontroller.h or .m, we're not able to control drag into this. So later on, we'll figure out how to add an additional view controller class in order to manage adding new view controllers to our project. But for right now, we don't need that functionality.